milestones in relations between Israel and the Kurds in general. But I will also try to avoid the parts that are already known and focus on the features of this relationship, with a focus on Iraqi Kurdistan. So we have basically 4 milestones in relations between Israel and the Kurdistan region. The first one, or the latest, is 2017, as Dr. Bayar also mentioned, is when the Kurdistan region of Iraq held the independence referendum, including the areas of disputed territories like Kirkuk and Sinjar. Ironically, Israel was the only outspoken supporter of the Kurdistan region's independence referendum. And that was definitely a milestone, and not because Israel decided to act alone and unilaterally without US or EU support, which often happens, but also there was this overt approval by the Kurdistan region leadership for voicing the potential of an alliance between Israel and the Kurdistan region. 2017 was very interesting, a very interesting year for the foreign relations of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, in references to many other state actors, but also to Israel, which was, again, a shock for the central Iraqi government and had repercussions in the end. What happened in 2017, in a nutshell, is Israel, from the highest level, including the president and the prime minister, voiced support for the KRG's bid for independence. With that said, rumors suggested that the then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu invited even US congressmen to Israel and tried to convince those politicians to support Iraqi Kurdistan. Israel was the only country calling on the US not to refrain from standing with the Kurds and do not leave them at the mercy of Iran, Turkey, and Iraq. Results of this, the conclusions were, for some, devastating, and for some, like me, were actually that actually bring nothing about. But before 2017, before the Kurdistan regional government even allowed protesters, demonstrators to hold Israeli flags in the center of Erbil and other Kurdish cities in Iraqi Kurdistan, 2014 was another milestone in these relations. In 2014, KRG's budget share from the overall Iraqi budget was cut by the central Iraqi government. And in accordance with what the current Prime Minister, Masroor Barzani, says, it was a time when the KRG started to sell its own natural resources without Baghdad's approval. That refers to, of course, oil. According to open source information that we have especially from tanker tracking websites, show that Israel is the #1 buyer of Kurdish oil. What rumors in Israel suggested was that Israel essentially replaced all of its suppliers to support Iraqi Kurdistan in a very tough economic situation. And KRG turned a blind eye on it, if not agreed to it. For 2014 and 2017 to emerge, a historical background is also required. And those historical backgrounds go back to 1970s and 1960s. One is what constituted the relations between Israel and the Kurdistan region, and the second is what ended those relations. In the 1960s, Israel had the policy of an outreach to the region, and the Kurds were the best candidate for the war against one of the strongest militaries, if not the strongest military of the Arab League, Iraq, in the mountains of northern Iraq. In the 50s and especially in the 60s and early 70s, it is confirmed that Israel had outposts and stations of Mossad and the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, in the mountains of Kurdistan, helping the Peshmerga to fight off Iraqi offensives. And to some personal memoirs by those who were involved in these operations, Israel even trained the Kurds of capturing and holding territory, which was new to Kurdistan, and the Kurdish fighters who only knew hit and run operations. But apparently, Israeli support was how to keep those territories that they captured from Iraq. One distinct feature of all these relations were everything was facilitated through Iran. And I can't emphasize this enough, because I will come to this again in my speech. 1979, the Khomeini revolution in Iran changed everything drastically. That is because there was no way for Israel to reach Iraqi Kurdistan mountains anymore, or Iraqi Kurds, except for meetings in Berlin and Paris or in Washington, D.C. There was no possibility for Iraqi Kurdish leadership to meet Israeli operatives or the leadership. And it also rendered the potential diplomatic, economic, and military support invalid for the Kurds. So this 1960s was one milestone that one needs to consider for how these relations were developed, and 1979 as the milestone that one needs to take into consideration to understand what is for the relations today. To summarize the Israeli approach, one needs to look at the region through an Israeli lens. Israel is an isolated island in the region. Even with the Abraham Accords, the situation has not changed yet. And very similar to the Kurds, Israel has always been in the pursuit of making new allies and friends. But most importantly, for Israel's image inside and abroad, making Muslim friends bear the most importance. Muslim nations, big nations in the region, once they are friended by the Israeli government, are considered actors that break the isolation of the country, which helps Israeli governments both in the national politics and abroad in international relations to proclaim that the isolation is over and Israel is here to stay in the Middle East, unlike the claims that the Zionist project will someday collapse. Kurds, Turks, Iranians were all tested in this policy. Even though Israel had a policy of supporting non-Muslim entities of the Middle East in the 40s and the 50s, it did not succeed. And ironically, it was achieved by Iran, actually, the main adversary of Israel at the moment. But Israel was successful in creating strong and fruitful relations with the Turkish population, with the Iranian population, and the Kurdish population, respectively. As I said, in 1979, everything ended between Israel and Kurdistan because Iran was a different Iran now. And some 50,000 Israelis who were stationed in Iran were out. After 1979, from the 80s to the 90s, Turkey, the biggest Muslim nation in the region, was among the allies of Israel to help fix the image of isolation, both in the country by providing Israelis the sense of security and by providing the international community of the continuity of the Zionist project in the Middle East, and Israel as a sovereign entity. 2010 ended the relations with Turkey as well, and even though Israel insisted a lot to repair these relations, it never happened. And Kurds emerged as another actor again for breaking the isolation. Another perspective from the Israeli side is exploiting the internal conflicts of its adversaries. which cannot be ruled out, because we know in relations with the Kurds, the IDF and all security apparatuses, including the intelligence units, are involved, and these entities have a strategic rationale, which includes the exploiting of internal conflicts of the adversaries. And one of the biggest was Iraq. Kurds being a very strong entity in Iraqi Kurdistan, a guerrilla force literally cornering Iraqi forces everywhere, and they fought them in the mountains of northern Iraq, was one of the best tools, if not partners, in the region to exploit a conflict within the Arab League and within the strongest army of the Arab League. Although this cannot be cross-checked with other regional conflicts, because we don't see Israeli involvement in regional conflicts, let's say the Baluchs in Iran or the Arabs in Iran or any other entity, we can see that the relations coming from the 60s and the 50s and the 70s were the fundamentals, what constituted an Israeli support to exploit the internal conflict within Iraq. With that said, apart from the strategic thinking and the military approach to it, there is also lots of pressure on the Israeli government from intellectual circles, from those who are actually either former government personnel or preparing to become government personnel. They're forced to improve the understanding of the region. And from the Israeli perspective, I'm quoting an Israeli security official once told me, the perspective starts with learning Arabic and local languages. That's why every single Israeli entity knows these languages. And having relations with a group of people, with the Kurds or any other group that is from the heart of the Middle East and the Muslim world, is believed to improve the understanding of the region and very much appreciated. So Israel is always on the look for relations with potential partners and allies in the region, not only for strategic reasons, but also for the reasons of improving the understanding of the region and how Israel approaches this region. With that said, there is also a distinct feature of Iraqi Kurds that makes them a suitable candidate for an Israeli alliance or partnership or support. That is the American and the European interference in their affairs. Tracking Israeli movements and policies in the region, one can see that Israel is seeking roles in every theater where U.S. and Europe is involved, in trying to capitalize on this interference in a strategic way to strengthen its standing in the region. Kurds was one of them. In 1991, the Kurds were protected by a US-led coalition. In the 80s, the Kurds had perhaps the best diplomatic relations of any non-state actor had in the Middle East. In mid-90s, the Kurds had, again, a semi-autonomous region and very strong relations with European and US partners. All these were factors for Israel to reconsider how it approaches the Kurds. And the conclusion was Iraqi Kurds should be evaluated differently than the rest, mainly because of the legitimacy that the Iraqi Kurdish groups had gained in the international politics and all other historical reasons I counted. Then there is the other side of the coin, the Kurds. The Iraqi Kurds. And how do they view the relations with Israel? Also set the conditions for how Israel approaches the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan. The main feature of, let's say, the fundamental of the of the Iraqi Kurdistan region's approach to Israel is differentiate Jewish entities from Israel. So KRG is keen on cooperating with Jewish entities, and it can be seen in every single diplomatic outreach that the KRG is pursuing, both in the US and in Europe. The Kurdistan region leadership has strong relations with Jewish institutions, lobbies, and any other supporting organizations that are either rumored or not rumored to be in connection with Israel. But KRG makes this distinction very clear. That distinction is the insurance policy of the regional government of having relations with Israel. So relations can be done in an indirect way. That's how the Erbil government is doing it. These relations with Jewish entities, the non-state actors, also visible in 2017 when the Kurdistan region went for a referendum, in addition to Israeli support, of course. Kurds of Iraq have been in a competition with the central Iraqi government over sovereignty. Unlike the Kurds of Turkey, Iran, and Syria, Iraqi Kurdistan focuses on territorial integrity and territorial control. And the dispute is actually on who claims sovereignty on Kurdistan. So every piece of option for Iraqi Kurdish leadership to claim sovereignty is considered a very strong or very beneficial factor. Rumors about Iraqi Kurdistan having relations with Israel, bypassing the central Iraqi government and ignoring Iraqi government's own mandates and laws, banning relations with Israel has been seen as a method of claiming or proclaiming sovereignty of the Kurdistan regional government and its distinct identity. So Iraqi Kurdistan successfully capitalizes on these rumors by not responding to them. Whenever there is a rumor about relations between the Kurdistan region and Israel, the KRG decides to stay silent or just deny the strategic facts, like there is no Mossad base in Erbil, but the KRG never said anything about not having relations with Israel or not meeting any Israeli official anywhere. We know, Dr. Bayar mentioned this comprehensively. After 2017, there were negotiations between the central Iraqi government and Kurdistan. One of the main topics was the Israeli presence in Iraqi Kurdistan. Central Iraqi government claiming that Israelis are traveling to Erbil because KRG is not abiding by the immigration laws of the central Iraqi government. That was that serious for KRG to keep that Israelis with or without Israeli passports to be present in Iraqi Kurdistan. Another thing that the Kurds consider important with having some sort of relations with Jewish institutions that can be interpreted as relations with Israel, be it right or wrong, I don't know, is breaking the image of weakness. That is also very visible in 2017, and perhaps the only answer one can come up with why the KRG leadership allowed hundreds of Israeli flags to be waved in Erbil, in Acre, in Dohuk, in Zahor, even at demonstrations attended by President Masoud Barzani himself. At demonstrations in Belgium, in the US, all organized by KRG, diplomatic missions abroad had Israeli organizations, pro-Israel organizations, and Israeli flags being waved at. And some claim that hundreds, if not thousands, of Israeli flags were imported by individual activists to Iraqi Kurdistan in 2017 just to display them in those demonstrations. The only answer to this very complicated move can be Kurdistan tried to break the image of weakness and isolation by claiming that a significant actor in the region perhaps the strongest with nuclear arms, is in support of Kurdistan's independence. So similar to Israel's attempts to break the image of isolation, KRG tried to do it, which did not help in the end. But one thing is clear: KRG refrains from any solid relations with Israel. There is no way to confirm that anyone from the Kurdistan region with an official capacity and an Iraqi passport visited Israel. There's no way to confirm there have been any intelligence level meetings between the two entities. There's no way to confirm if there are any military relations between these two. That is because the Erbil leadership refrains from having any solid relations with Israel. In my 10 years in Israel, coordinating a program that specifically focused on the Kurdistan region and the Kurds, I haven't seen any solid relations either. So that is, but I also know that Israel is ready, even today, to make these relations solid. Finally, I'll go to this very short discussion of what is happening with these relations when they're open and they're closed, when they're overt and covert. Open relations with KRG benefits Israel. We all know that. And Israel is ready to even elevate these relations to a diplomatic presence for reasons that are specifically related to Israel and the Israeli government and its image of isolation and its strategic goals, its enmity with Iran, its desired role in the Gulf, and everything else. Its worsening relations with Turkey are all these factors that convince Israel, in addition to pressure from intellectual circles, Jews from Kurdistan in Israel. All of these convince Israel to have open relations with KRG. And 2017 was a clear indicator when Israel came out at various highest levels, announcing support for KRG and support for open relations. This is unlike Syrian or Iranian or Turkish Kurds. None of these entities are welcome to have open relations with Israel. And if they have close relations like rumored for KRG, that's another case. But on the same time, KRG is aware of its geographical limitations, and that is a severe one. It's a landlocked region that relies on basically Turkey and Iran, and at times on Iraq, and very rarely on Syria. But there's no way out. There's no independent airspace, and even KRG one day achieves its own, controlling its own airspace. Its airspace will only be accessible to the airspaces of a neighboring country. There's no access to the water, to sea, basically rendering any connections to Israel. There's no shared border, but there's a shared border with Iran. There's a shared border with Turkey. KRG is very well aware of this geographical limitations, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage, and Israel falls under the disadvantage category. Relations with Israel are dependent on the approval of Turkey and the approval of Iran. Before 1979, it was all approved by Iran. Mossad agents, IDF, all Israeli operatives were based in Iran, and the Iranian government allowed them to access Iraqi Kurdistan's mountains to help the Peshmerga. 2014, when Israel started to buy Kurdish oil, every single tanker departing to Israel departed from Turkish ports. Apparently, Turkey was approving this. There's no possible way of having strategic relations without relying on a neighboring country. And provided that Israel has the worst possible relations with Turkey and Iran at present, it's even more sophisticates the geographical limitation that the KRG is aware of. But in the meantime, KRG is aware of Israel's diplomatic and economic outreach. And that was again proven in 2017. Israel is the gateway for Kurdistan to reach various actors, be it state or non-state, be it lobbies or economic, and in North America and in Europe. And Kurdistan tried to rely on this in 2017 as it was in a panic mode because of the upcoming assessed Iraqi operations against the Kurdish presence in the disputed territories and maybe in the Kurdistan region proper, plus all this international pressure. KRG hoped that Israel's maybe attempts to convince the Iraqi government the U.S. government to support Iraqi Kurdistan. Never happened, but who knows? I mean, who knows? Maybe something happened that we don't know. I'll sum it up this way. I tried to think of a punchline of, just to summarize this speech. I would say Israel for KRG is a friend in crises, but not a friend in emergencies. It is a friend in crises. When KRG is in a crisis, like 2014, like in the 70s, like 2014 with the budget crisis, like 2017 with the political crisis with both Baghdad and Washington, Israel was a great help. Israel, both Kurdish oil, so when the US imposed an embargo on Kurdish oil sales in conjunction with Baghdad, Israel was buying the Kurdish oil like to the extent of 70% of its all oil imports. In 2017, KRG was in a huge dispute with the entire world, united against it for its referendum, in support of the central Iraqi government, Iran and Turkey, which, as a very rare occasion, Israel was the only one that allowed KRG to have a diplomatic outreach, at least have some relief, and at least break the image of isolation at home, so the Kurds could continue to support the referendum. So on. But emergencies are what dictates relationships in the Middle East, what dictates alliances in the Middle East, or friendship. Friends must be friends also in emergency situations. And Israel lacks this capacity to help the Kurds in case of an emergency, because there's no shared border, there is no military outreach, there is no possibility for supporting the Kurds other than with the use of air power, which is significantly tricky itself, and every other type of relationship that is not violating the airspaces of the surrounding countries. That is not only military, though. Any trade relations can also violate the airspace, because Israeli planes cannot fly over Syria and Iraq officially. There's no everything else relies on the neighboring states' approvals. So it's a situation of friends in crises, but not friends in emergency. Thank you. I see the question, yeah. So why the public support to the KRG did not continue is a great question after the referendum. First of all, the Kurds were not in a crisis mode anymore. So the second thing was that Israel was actually notified several times that Israeli support for Kurdistan could be a bad thing for the Kurds. And the initiative should come from the KRG side and not from the Israeli side. 2017 support for the referendum was initiated by Israel and was later used by the Kurdistan region government. So it was not a requested support from the Kurdish side, but the Kurdish side did not say no, which resulted in the gradual escalation and the increase in Israeli support. However, things have changed in Kurdistan after 2017. The Kurds lost a significant portion of their strategic and geopolitical importance by losing Kirkuk, some other disputed territories in the south, and especially Sinjar on the border with Syria. The Kurds lost a lot of importance because of having very bad relations with the central Iraqi government, and Iraqi government sanctions on Kurdistan by banning the airspace, by closing all the border crossings, by withholding the budget that led to the unpaid salaries for over 3 years. All of these accumulated to reduce the international perception on the strategic importance of Kurdistan. And Kurdistan was and is still considered a very weak entity that can be easily targeted by the central Iraqi government and Iran and even Turkey. That is one of the reasons that Israel did not have any opportunities to follow up with its support in 2017, and plus, I personally believe that Israel was privately asked to stop because of the ramifications that the KRG faced after this. But if going back to the nature of the relations between Israel and Kurdistan, it is always a sophisticated game for Israel and Kurdistan to play. And 2017 was an extraordinary opportunity for this to be played differently. 2017 was a crisis, and the referendum was out of a crisis itself. Was the very rare and extraordinary opportunity for things to appear differently, things to be played and pursued differently. That was a very temporary solution by KRG to allow Israel or not deny Israel's support. In a meeting, Fuad Hussein, the former prime minister, the former vice president of Iraqi Kurdistan region, appreciated Israeli support for the referendum. I believe we were together there, Mariana, at the meeting in Erbil. That was a very rare opportunity, a very rare case that KRG would actually say something about Israel is doing for Kurdistan. This ended right after the crisis in the aftermath of the referendum, after the KRG started to roll back what it did for several years, be it right or wrong, and it left no room for Israel to voice support anymore, with the significant risk that it could cause a black backlash. It could even cause KRG coming out against Israel under the pressure of Iran, Turkey, and especially the central Iraqi government. I agree with Dr. Bayar, whatever he said about Iran and Turkey, and I really like the part he mentioned that Iran is now sandwiching somehow surrounding Kurdistan from all sides. That case is going to be there. And Kurds, Iraqi Kurdistan, changed its strategy drastically after 2017. Until 2017, Iraqi Kurdistan was the sole entity fighting Iran in Iraq. In 2017, KRG understood that it was in vain. And there was no logic in fighting Iranian presence in Iraq without a US support, or at least US being in Baghdad and planning to stay longer. So after witnessing that the US left KRG alone in the fight against a military, literally commanded by Iranian commanders, Persian-speaking commanders, had led to drastic changes in how KRG operates in Iraq. That also left no room for Israel to voice diplomatic support for Iraqi Kurdistan. So, when Israel is likely to be asked to stop because there were ramifications for KRG. Two, KRG lost most of its strategic importance due to the fallbacks it had in northern Iraq and in the economic sphere. And three, KRG changed its strategy drastically, making a U-turn from combating Iran to having better relations with Iran.